Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. When Karen goes too far, there's a hero to put her in her place. HOA President Karen is punished more than ever. My name's John, and I'm 45. I've spent pretty much my entire adult life working. I started out delivering goods to sporting goods stores, then went on to open my own sporting goods business. Back in the day, I used to think that the most important thing was working hard from dawn till dusk to provide for my family. Eventually, this work obsession, as I initially saw it, led to the collapse of my marriage. Though to be honest, it wasn't just work. My wife was constantly accusing me of cheating on her, even though I never did. We'd been together more than 20 years. Our marriage was hanging by a thread for a long time, and I used to blame myself for pouring too much time into my business. I even decided I'd hire managers to run my stores so I could spend more time with her. My kids had just turned 18 and were starting their own adult lives, so one day I came home early from work, intending to tell my wife I was retiring, but that day became my moment of truth. I caught her in bed with another man. It was painfully clear. Instead of going into a rage, I felt this strange sense of relief. I finally realized that chapter of my life needed to close. And the best part was knowing it wasn't my fault. We got divorced and she ended up with nothing because all the evidence was in my favor, plus our kids were already adults so I could handle their financial matters directly. And that's how I ended up on my own. I put our former house on the market and decided to head back for a while at least to the town where I was born. It wasn't that far, a place in my home state up north on the East Coast. I made the choice pretty quickly because I had some real estate options I owned out there. During the time my sporting goods stores were thriving, I'd bought 2 apartment buildings for rental income. My real estate agent, Ron, an old buddy and business partner, handled managing them for me. I hardly ever showed up at those buildings in person, so the tenants only really knew the agency. Leases were signed with Ron's firm, though I was officially listed as owner. I found it convenient to stay behind the scenes and avoid extra chatter. One of these 3-story buildings had 5 separate apartments, each rented by a family or a single tenant. Right before I moved, a unit on the 2nd floor opened up. The previous renters were leaving for a job in another state. I asked Ron to set aside that apartment for me. My plan was to stay there until I figured out what to do with my life next. That's how I ended up in this old but cozy building sometime in the late 90s. I told Ron not to tell the neighbors who I really was because I really didn't want everyone paying attention to me. I wanted a clean start, just to be a regular renter without special perks, drama, or gossip. For the first few days, everything was quiet. Then I met her, Karen. She was around 50, though she tried to appear a little younger. She always had a short haircut, wore suits like a school principal, and had this piercing voice. She was president of the HOA in our building, though around here it was more of a local residents association that set some house rules and held meetings. But Karen seemed to treat her presidency like it was a royal crown. Neighbors whispered that Karen used to be quite nice back in the day, but power had really spoiled her. It's like she lost her mind from the feeling of control, said one of our longtime neighbors, Mrs. Parsons. Karen had a husband, a skinny, weary-looking guy whose eyes were always half shut from fatigue. He seemed like he hadn't slept in 10 years, never contradicted his wife, and always hovered silently behind her. We first met by chance. I was coming back from the grocery store with a few cans of beer and some food and almost collided with Karen. She didn't even bother with small talk. A new face. You must be the new tenant, right? I'm the HOA president, by the way, and we have strict rules here. You need to fill out this form, she said, handing me some document. Also, if you have any pets, you're required to notify me personally. I told her I didn't have any pets and that I'd handle the paperwork once I finished unpacking. She folded her arms sternly and declared, just so you know, I keep a close eye on any noise violations, indecent behavior, or unsanitary conditions. Drunks with beer don't last long here. The way she said that honestly made me laugh, but I just nodded politely. Later, another neighbor told me Karen had this habit of shouting people down like she had Tourette's syndrome, though no official diagnosis existed. Most folks figured this over-the-top, foul-mouthed manner was just her way of flexing her authority as president. There were 4 other households in the building, including an elderly woman named Mrs. Clark. She was over 70, lived on her own, but looked pretty energetic. She wore her long white hair in a neat bun, and on weekends she'd bake pies and share them with neighbors if she was in a good mood. One day, she brought me a fragrant apple pie to welcome me to the building. I thanked her warmly and asked if she could recommend any nearby stores worth visiting. But just as she was about to answer, we heard the shrill voice echoing through the hallway. "What's going on here?" That was Karen. She practically sprinted down the stairs and pointed her finger at Mrs. Clark's pie. "What are you doing handing out food without permission? Mrs. Clark, you know we have rules against distributing homemade products that aren't certified. People could get food poisoning." I couldn't help but laugh. It was probably a nervous laugh because the situation was so ridiculous, but Karen took that personally. No joke. She started lecturing the poor lady on food safety violations. Mrs. Clark, stone-faced, just said, "Sweetheart, I haven't harmed a soul. I've been baking pies for 50 years and nobody's died yet. If you don't like it, don't eat it." But Karen acted like she didn't hear a word. For several minutes, she railed about how she was going to impose a fine and report this to the landlord. I just calmly carried the pie into my apartment, inviting Mrs. Clark inside while Karen practically frothed at the mouth. I didn't step in because I still wasn't ready to reveal that I was, in fact, the landlord. I was pretty sure Karen had decided to make Mrs. Clark her new target, but Mrs. Clark had a sense of humor and would respond with playful little digs. This only fired Karen up more. At one point, Karen demanded, "I want all your visitors to check in with me personally. Here's the form," she said, shoving a sheet of paper at her that read, "Visitor's full name, arrival and departure time, purpose of visit." Mrs. Clark just smiled sweetly. "Of course, dear, absolutely. My grandson's coming next week. He'll fill it all out in detail." And he did, except he wrote sarcastic stuff like, "Purpose of visit, to save the world from another HOA president." I glimpsed Karen nearly ripping her hair out over those insults. Then another silly argument arose. Karen discovered that Mrs. Clark had overwatered a potted plant on the windowsill, so a little water dripped onto the floor, creating a small damp spot. Karen called it a flood, threatened to call a plumber, and demanded compensation for damages to the building. At some point in the shouting match, Karen literally snatched the flower pot from the older woman's hands and threw it outside, announcing, "I'll evict you, you old bee." It would have been funny if it weren't so nerve-wracking for the neighbors. I heard from many of them that Karen harassed anyone who didn't follow her laws. At night, I could hear her scolding her husband, making him do house patrols to check if anyone had unauthorized guests, even though the building was mostly families and retirees who never made any trouble. Whenever she turned her temper on me, I responded with maximum politeness because I had neither the desire nor the need to get into a feud. I was still hoping that maybe she was just testing the waters, but Karen seemed to take my calmness as weakness. A couple weeks later, she started openly talking about wanting to clean out the building of undesirables. I overheard her mentioning me now and then, calling me a divorced loser who probably blew all his money on alimony and booze. Maybe that gave her some kind of ego boost? The more I watched, the clearer it became. Karen wanted to drive me out because she loved being in control and probably thought she could replace me with someone easier to boss around. Eventually, my agent, Ron, hit his breaking point. He told me Karen was basically bombarding his office with complaints demanding they terminate my lease and kick me out for one absurd reason after another, that I walked too loudly in the hallways, I damaged the walls, or there were photos of crushed beer cans by my door at night, which I certainly never put there and never even saw. She also accused me of bringing in drug addicts, claiming a strange smell was coming from my windows. In reality, my adult kids had visited me twice, and no one has the right to call my kids junkies. Ron asked if maybe it was time to show our cards, and I agreed. If we waited any longer, Karen might do something even crazier. But the funniest thing happened the day before we finally acted, and it again involved Mrs. Clark. According to another neighbor, Karen saw Mrs. Clark throw her trash into the wrong bin. We have 5 trash cans out there, all the same, and nobody usually cares who throws what where. Karen started yelling that each apartment had its own designated bin, and anyone who broke that rule would pay the price. This time, instead of joking around, Mrs. Clark just said, "I don't care which bin I use. They all end up in the same garbage truck anyway." Karen, as if someone had flipped her crazy witch switch, screamed, "Oh, so you don't care where your trash goes at all?" Then she grabbed a handful of rotten veggies, some cabbage and carrot scraps from her own bin and scattered them right in front of Mrs. Clark's door, proudly announcing, "Then let it lie here, smarty pants." Mrs. Clark reacted instantly. She frowned, mumbled a few choice words under her breath, words you wouldn't expect from a sweet old lady, scooped the trash back up, threw it right at Karen, and walked into her apartment, slamming the door. Everyone who saw this show just stood there, jaws on the floor. It'd gone way past normal. An hour or so later, Ron arrived with an official letter saying that Karen's lease would not be renewed. It ended in a month and a half, and we were officially giving notice of her eviction. The reason was obvious: destructive, aggressive behavior toward other tenants, plus multiple complaints about her. Interestingly, the lease was actually in her husband's name because Karen didn't work, so legally this was all perfectly valid. Once the contract was up, we simply weren't renewing and they had to vacate. Ron called a small tenant meeting to explain the updated rules and the new rental agreements. Karen and her husband showed up angry, probably thinking she'd convince everyone to kick me out. She was sure that was the meeting's main point. Instead, Ron calmly read the notice. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be informed that Karen and her husband must vacate their apartment by date. The lease has ended and it will not be renewed." Karen shouted, "What the hell is this? I'm the HOA president. I decide who stays in this building, not the other way around. I know the landlord." At that point, I stood up. Karen still didn't get it. I looked her in the eye and said, "No, the landlord decides. And by the way, I'm the owner." She barked that I was just a drunken loser. Ron clarified, "This man is the property owner, Mr." and he read out my name. I watched Karen's face change instantly. She went pale, her jaw dropped, then she turned red. A split second later, she sputtered, You're the owner? This is some kind of sick joke." I nodded calmly. "I own this building and 2 more in the area. Ron manages my rentals, so you've only dealt with the agency. I purposely stayed anonymous because I didn't want extra attention, but your behavior has made it clear to me that there's no reason to renew your lease." Silence fell over the meeting room. Even Karen's husband said nothing, just stared at the floor. I went on, "I've seen and heard plenty. Constant arguments, disrespect towards neighbors, the way you treated Mrs. Clark, the baseless complaints about me. So, per the lease, you have about a month left before you have to leave. If you contest it, well, it's all legal. The lease term's up, and we're notifying you in advance that we're not renewing." Karen started yelling, "You're all in on this. I won't let it end like this. I'm going to sue. I'm the HOA president." Ultimately, she tore up the letter, threw it on the floor, and barged out of the room, elbowing everyone aside. I just sighed and said, "Somebody please remind her that by state law, we're fully entitled not to renew." Let's hope she rethinks this and moves out without any more drama. Everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief. Many neighbors thanked me later, saying, "At last, that psycho's gone." Karen actually left 3 days later. She didn't even stay for the remaining month. One morning, I saw her and her husband loading boxes into an old pickup, hauling out their furniture, refusing to look at any of us. By evening, I noticed the door to their old apartment was wide open and nobody was inside. That was the end of her era. Epilogue. Once Karen was gone, the building felt incredibly peaceful. I'm still living in that same apartment, and sometimes I act more openly as the landlord for small repairs or improvements, but there have been no more blowouts or surprises. I hope Karen and her tired husband found a new place where nobody will let her claim another president title. I'm glad everything ended well. I wish there were more landlords like this for every Karen. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.